For most of European history, if you were a wealthy landowner with 4 children, exactly one of them inherited almost everything. Not the smartest one, not the one who needed it most, the oldest. The other 3 received little more than a formal education, a modest allowance, and a polite send-off into the world to make their own way. This wasn't considered cruel, it was considered responsible. Today, most old money families no longer hand everything to a single eldest child. But the underlying instinct behind that old system never actually disappeared. It simply evolved into something more sophisticated, more deliberate, and, in its own way, more controversial. The quiet, well-documented tendency of wealthy families to divide their fortunes unequally, on purpose, using legal tools most people have never heard of. Today we're examining exactly why, the history behind it, the specific laws that allow it, and the modern instruments that make it possible. If you want the real architecture behind generational wealth, including the parts that quietly contradict everything we're taught about fairness, subscribe now. This channel decodes it every week. The original system, why everything went to one child. To understand why old money still resists equal division today, you have to understand the system that came before it, a system explicitly designed around the opposite principle. Primogeniture, from Latin roots meaning roughly firstborn, was the practice of passing an entire estate to a single heir, almost always the eldest son, while other children received comparatively little. It emerged across medieval Western Europe alongside feudalism, and by the 16th century, legal arrangements called entails, which restricted an estate's succession specifically to eldest sons, were common not just in England, but across France, Italy, Castile, and Poland. The logic behind it had almost nothing to do with love or favoritism, and everything to do with a specific practical problem. Land doesn't divide well. A large estate split evenly among 4 children doesn't produce 4 smaller versions of the same prosperous estate. It produces 4 fragments, each too small to be economically self-sufficient, each generating a fraction of the income, employing a fraction of the staff, and wielding a fraction of the political and social influence the original estate had. Do that across a few generations of equal division, and a great family fortune doesn't survive. It dissolves into dust, one inheritance at a time. Historians who study this pattern note it was most common specifically in agricultural societies, where a family's entire economic and social standing was tied directly to land ownership, and where fragmenting that land, even with the best of intentions toward fairness, was functionally equivalent to fragmenting the family's future. The entailed estate and the primogeniture rule that usually accompanied it wasn't a preference for one child over the others emotionally. It was a structural decision to preserve one thing: the estate itself, even at the direct expense of equal treatment among the people who might otherwise have claimed a piece of it. This system didn't survive into the modern era intact, and its collapse is its own interesting story. Primogeniture was abolished in the newly formed United States remarkably quickly. Virginia struck it down in 1785, driven in large part by Thomas Jefferson's democratic philosophy, with Georgia and North Carolina having already done so a few years earlier. The French Revolution dismantled it in France entirely, and Napoleon's subsequent civil code went even further, guaranteeing every legitimate child a protected share of a parent's estate, a legal principle, as we'll see shortly, that still shapes French inheritance law today and stands in direct, fascinating opposition to how inheritance still works in the United States. But here's the detail that matters most for this video. The practice died. The underlying instinct didn't. Old money families no longer hand an entire fortune to a single eldest child. But the core insight behind primogeniture, that dividing certain assets equally can actively destroy them, never went away. It simply found new legal tools to express itself through. The legal loophole. Why America lets you do this at all. Before we get into how modern families actually engineer unequal inheritance, it's worth understanding something most Americans never realize. In a huge portion of the world, what old money families do here would simply be illegal. France operates under a legal principle called forced heirship, rooted directly in the Napoleonic Code we just discussed, and still enshrined in the French Constitution today. Under this system, a fixed mandatory portion of a person's estate, called the reserve héréditaire, must legally pass to their children, regardless of what a will says. The math is precise. Under the French Civil Code, a parent with one child must leave that child at least half the estate. With two children, each is guaranteed a third. With three or more, 3/4 of the estate is protected and must be split among them. A parent literally cannot disinherit a child, favor one over another beyond these bounds, or leave the bulk of the estate to charity instead. The law simply overrides the will wherever it conflicts. This isn't a fringe rule confined to France. Similar forced heirship systems operate across most of continental Europe. Germany, Spain, and many other civil law countries all guarantee children a protected share of a parent's estate that no will can remove. Legal scholars trace the philosophy behind this back to a specific worldview. Civil law countries tend to treat family wealth as something belonging, in part, to the family unit itself, not solely to the individual who happens to hold legal title to it at any given moment. The United States and the United Kingdom operate on the opposite principle entirely: testamentary freedom. With one notable exception, Louisiana, whose legal system still carries traces of French civil law and maintains its own limited forced heirship rules for young or disabled children. American parents can generally leave their estate to whomever they choose, in whatever proportions they choose, including leaving an adult child nothing at all. Legal scholars trace this directly to the common law tradition's starting assumption that property belongs to the individual who owns it, not to the family as a collective unit, and that individual retains near total discretion over its disposal at death. This is the legal bedrock underneath everything else in this video. Unequal inheritance isn't a clever trick old money has found a way to get away with. It's simply what the law in most English-speaking countries has always permitted, full stop. A wealthy family in Paris genuinely cannot do most of what we're about to describe, no matter how sophisticated their attorneys are. A wealthy family in New York, London, or Los Angeles can, and old money families in those jurisdictions have quietly built an entire toolkit around exercising exactly that freedom. This is exactly the kind of comparative mechanism-first breakdown this channel exists for. If this legal contrast surprised you, drop a comment with the word reserve. It tells me you want more deep dives into the real machinery behind generational wealth. Equal is not the same as equitable. Now that we understand why American families are legally free to divide their estates however they choose, let's get into how, starting with the foundational distinction that shapes almost every decision that follows. Estate planners consistently draw a line between two goals that most families assume are identical: equal distribution, where every heir receives a mathematically identical share, and equitable distribution, where every heir receives what the family considers genuinely fair, given each person's actual circumstances, which frequently means very different dollar amounts. Roughly 90% of parents, by most estimates, default to strict equal distribution, largely because it's simple and requires no uncomfortable conversation about why one child might receive more or less than another. But equal distribution creates a specific, well-documented failure mode wherever a family's wealth includes an asset that genuinely can't be divided without damaging it, most commonly a family business. Picture a founder with 3 adult children. One has spent 15 years working inside the company, learning every part of the operation, eventually running it. The other 2 built entirely separate careers with no involvement in the business at all. Equal distribution, applied literally, hands all 3 children identical ownership stakes, which means the 2 children with 0 operating history now have equal legal say over daily decisions in a company they've never worked inside, alongside the sibling who actually built their career running it. Attorneys who handle family business succession describe this as one of the single most reliable generators of long-term family conflict, precisely because it wasn't designed with malice. It was designed with a well-meaning, but ultimately mismatched, sense of fairness. The equitable alternative, used consistently across sophisticated estate plans, keeps the value equal while changing the asset. The child running the business inherits the business itself, along with the authority to run it without needing sign-off from siblings who've never worked there. The siblings outside the business receive other assets of genuinely comparable value: investment portfolios, real estate, or, very often, a life insurance policy specifically sized to close the gap. Nobody ends up with less, but nobody ends up holding a stake in something they have no ability or desire to actually manage either. The deeper principle running underneath all of this, and it's worth stating plainly because families so rarely say it out loud: an identical number is not automatically a fair outcome, and treating those 2 things as interchangeable is often exactly what turns a reasonable family decision into decades of resentment. The incentive trust, making heirs earn their own inheritance. Beyond simply dividing assets unequally between siblings, some of the most sophisticated old money estate plans go a step further, making the size of any individual's inheritance conditional on their own behavior, effort, or achievement. This tool is called an incentive trust. Unlike a standard trust, which typically distributes assets outright at a fixed age or on a fixed schedule regardless of what the beneficiary is actually doing with their life, an incentive trust ties distributions directly to specific, predefined conditions. Estate planning attorneys describe the appeal plainly. Many wealthy clients worry that leaving too large an inheritance to a child, with no strings attached at all, will actively spoil that child, removing their motivation to build a career, develop real competence, or become what one planning guide bluntly calls a productive member of society, rather than what the same planners sometimes describe as a professional heir who does nothing but live off inherited wealth indefinitely. The specific conditions families choose vary enormously, and some of them are genuinely creative. One well-documented structure, sometimes nicknamed the investment banker clause, matches a beneficiary's own earned income, dollar for dollar out of the trust, A child who earns $80,000 a year at a real job receives a matching $80,000 distribution, while a child who earns nothing receives nothing that year, regardless of how much money technically sits in trust waiting for them. Other common structures reward the completion of a college degree, sustained employment, charitable service, or launching a business, while some trusts explicitly instruct the trustee to withhold distributions during periods of active substance abuse. These structures aren't without real, well-documented risk, and it's worth being honest about the trade-off, rather than presenting incentive trusts as a flawless solution. Estate planners caution that overly rigid conditions frequently backfire. A trust that only rewards a college degree can unfairly penalize a beneficiary who builds a genuinely successful career as a tradesperson or entrepreneur instead. A trust conditioned narrowly on marriage excludes anyone who remains single by choice. And conditions tied to sensitive personal matters like sobriety can create serious friction between a trustee who may need to review private medical records to verify compliance, and a beneficiary who reasonably resents that level of scrutiny into their personal life. The most carefully drafted incentive trusts, planners note, build in real trustee discretion specifically to handle circumstances the family never anticipated, rewarding the spirit of a goal, self-sufficiency, effort, stability, rather than a single rigid literal box to check. The philosophy underneath all of it circles back to the same instinct that drove primogeniture centuries earlier, just aimed at a different target. Where primogeniture protected an estate from being divided into unproductive fragments, the incentive trust protects a person from receiving unearned wealth in a form the family believes would fragment their own character and drive instead. If terms like incentive trust and investment banker clause are new to you, that's exactly why this channel exists, to make this language usable. Subscribe so the rest of this series doesn't get lost in your feed. The tools that make unequal feel fair. Beyond the business carve-out and the incentive trust, families building an intentionally unequal plan rely on a handful of additional, well-established legal tools, designed specifically to keep the plan from feeling arbitrary or punitive to the people receiving less. The first is life insurance as an equalizer, a tool we've discussed in earlier videos on this channel, and it appears here for good reason. If one heir receives a family business or a piece of real estate that can't practically be divided, a life insurance policy, funded specifically to name the other heirs as beneficiaries, can deliver a comparable dollar value to everyone else without ever touching the underlying asset itself. The business stays whole and stays with the person actually running it, while the rest of the family receives a genuinely equivalent inheritance in a different form. The second is the disclaimer provision, a clause built directly into an estate plan that gives any heir the legal right to voluntarily refuse all or part of what they've been left. This tool solves a specific, delicate problem. Imagine one adult child is already independently wealthy through their own career, while a sibling genuinely needs the inheritance. Rather than a parent making the awkward, potentially resentment-generating decision to simply leave the wealthier child less from the outset, a disclaimer provision lets that child make the choice themselves, voluntarily redirecting their share toward a sibling or the next generation, turning a parent's unilateral judgment call into the wealthier heir's own generous decision instead. The third is the pot trust, a single trust that holds assets for multiple beneficiaries within the same generation, generally the writer's grandchildren, without locking in a fixed, predetermined split between them from the outset. This structure is especially common for covering something like education expenses across several grandchildren of different ages, rather than dividing a fixed sum evenly per child, regardless of actual need. A pot trust lets a trustee direct more toward whichever grandchild is actually in college that year, and less toward one who hasn't reached that stage yet, need-based rather than head-count-based, and often rebalancing naturally over time as circumstances change. What unites all three of these tools is the same underlying goal: give the family plan enough flexibility that unequal doesn't have to mean unfair, and enough structure that fairness doesn't have to be renegotiated awkwardly every single year. This is the part of old money estate planning that rarely gets explained clearly. The specific instruments that let a family be genuinely fair without being mathematically identical. If you want the mechanism-first version of this world every week, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The conversation that makes or breaks the whole plan. Every legal tool covered in this video, the business carve-out, the incentive trust, the equalizing life insurance policy, the disclaimer provision, depends entirely on one final non-legal ingredient to actually succeed. The family has to talk about it out loud while everyone is still alive to hear the reasoning. We covered this dynamic in detail in an earlier video on this channel about how old money families avoid feuds, and it applies with even greater force here, because unequal inheritance carries a specific emotional risk that equal inheritance simply doesn't. A child who receives less and is never told why will reliably interpret that gap as a verdict on how much they were loved, regardless of how sound the underlying business or tax logic actually was. A perfectly reasonable decision to leave the family business to the child who spent 15 years building it, discovered for the first time by the other siblings while reading a will after a funeral, tends to land as a searing personal rejection rather than the practical, values-based decision it actually was. Families who successfully use unequal inheritance planning tend to share one specific habit. They explain the reasoning to every heir, individually and directly, years before it ever becomes relevant. Not as an apology and not as a negotiation, as a simple, calm statement of the family's values and logic, delivered while the parent is still present to answer questions, absorb pushback, and make clear that a smaller inheritance in one category was never a smaller measure of love. This is, in the end, the single detail that separates a functional unequal inheritance plan from a lawsuit waiting to happen. The legal tools in this video are on their own completely neutral. A business carve-out, an incentive trust, a disclaimer provision, all of it can be drafted flawlessly by a skilled attorney and still produce a fractured family if it's simply handed down, unexplained, as a surprise. The families who avoid that outcome treat the conversation itself as no less important than the paperwork. Arguably more important, since paperwork alone has never once repaired a relationship that broke the day. A will was finally read out loud. Here's what ties every rule in this video together. From the medieval entail to the modern incentive trust, old money has never actually believed that fairness requires identical numbers. What it has believed consistently across nearly 1,000 years of legal evolution is that certain things, a family estate, a family business, a family member's own drive and character, can be genuinely damaged by treating equal and fair as synonyms. The tools have changed almost beyond recognition. A medieval lord protecting his estate through entail, and a modern founder protecting a family business through a carefully drafted trust are, in a real sense, solving the exact same underlying problem 7 centuries apart. What separates the families who pull this off gracefully from the ones who end up in courtrooms isn't the sophistication of the legal instrument. It's whether the family had the harder conversation first. Old money doesn't distribute its wealth unequally out of favoritism. It distributes deliberately, protecting the things that don't survive being split evenly, and being honest, while everyone is still alive to hear it, about exactly why. If this changed how you think about fairness, inheritance, and what old money actually optimizes for, subscribe to Old Money Opulence. New investigations into the real culture behind generational wealth drop every week. And if you want to see what happens when this conversation doesn't happen in time, watch the companion video How Old Money Families Avoid Family Feuds walks through the governance tools, family councils, constitutions, and neutral mediators that keep an unequal plan from ever becoming a courtroom battle. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.